Queensland all year. I'm really pleased to report that after a lot of work from our Chief Health Officer, as well as detailed conversations between the Premier and the Chief Minister of the Australian Capital Territory and between our government and the Canberra Airport, we are announcing today that we will lift border restrictions on the ACT from 1 a.m. next Friday. That means that people from the ACT will again be able to visit Queensland. We've been saying for some time now that for Queenslanders, Queensland is good to go. Well, now for Canberrans, Queensland is good to come. And so now is the time we would urge them to start thinking about coming up to Queensland for a holiday. This is timed to coincide with the school holidays in the ACT. It's a great chance for people to come and visit friends and relatives or go to the reef, go to Cairns, go to one of our wonderful tourism hotspots. This is great news for the ACT and of course is recognition of the fact that they have been some time now without any active cases. We're also confirming today that sewage testing in the Hervey Bay region has identified very low levels of viral fragments in the wastewater there. The hospital and health service there will be taking necessary steps to ensure that there isn't any unidentified community transmission there. It's a bit like the Alley Beach situation we outlined to you not long ago. There's no reason at all to panic. We're just letting people know that we have those results and that there may be some activity from the public health unit there.
So very good news, no new cases. So we remain at 54 cases related to that cluster, that Melbourne-Logan cluster, the Brisbane Youth Detention Centre cluster, Arthur Gorrie and the Corrective Services Academy and the Ipswich Hospital. So we've not had any case out in the community infectious in the last 8 days, which is really good, and we just wait to see what happens over the coming days. It's a little bit too early to totally relax, so it's really important, more important than ever, that if you have any symptoms, to come forward and to get tested and to isolate yourself till you get that result. This is important across the whole state. As you've just heard from the Deputy Premier, we are testing sewage across the state now, and we are picking up virus every so often. We're not sure at this point in time what that really means, but we're taking, of course, a very cautious approach to that, and wherever we're finding virus, we're asking people to come out and get tested so that we make sure we don't have community transmission in that community. We know you can shed virus for a long, long time, but we don't want to ignore the fact that perhaps, maybe, that virus is there in the sewage due to a recent infection. So that's why we're doing this, just to be very careful. But it's really important that across the state that people continue to come forward to get tested. So I always say, if we can find the first case in a cluster, we can clamp down on it very, very quickly and not end up in a large outbreak. No, at this stage it's still 28 days. That, of course, is the safest, because then if you do miss one transmission cycle, you then will be more likely to pick it up the next. So it's just being really careful. You might remember we had that gap between our initial cluster from those 3 young women who went to Melbourne and then opened up, and we got a second cluster, and now it's pretty certain they're related. So it's just all about the risk of having a cluster that you don't pick up. I'm convinced that that's been sorted because of the work that's been done between Queensland and the ACT. So anyone who goes from New South Wales to Canberra will need to wait for 14 days before they can come to Queensland.
So you mean they'll have to quarantine in Canberra for 14 days before they can come in?
Well, not quarantine because Canberra doesn't have that in place, but they will have to stay in the ACT for 14 days. So people can come to Queensland today as long as they have not been in a declared hotspot in the previous 14 days. So people can come from the ACT as long as they haven't been in a declared hotspot, which is currently New South Wales and Victoria, in the previous 14 days. No, loss of voice is not a symptom of coronavirus, and every single day that we meet at AHPPC, we discuss whether symptoms should be added to the list. So most recently we added diarrhoea, vomiting and nausea to that list. We've also recently added a runny nose, but no, loss of voice is not a symptom, no. But she was ultra cautious, and that is what I ask of every Queenslander. She was ultra cautious, and although there was no need for her to do it, she went and got herself tested. No, but I would encourage them to, as the Premier did, that if you've got a symptom, it's a good idea to go and get tested. Rather than think through, is it COVID, isn't it COVID, just get yourself tested. What we don't need, though, is perfectly well people to get tested. We still are testing a lot of perfectly well people because they're unsure, and that's fine, and we do that, but there is no need for it. It is really important that people who have symptoms get themselves tested. That's correct.
Right, okay. So how are you going to guarantee, or maybe it's one Minister, how is it going to be guaranteed that people coming in haven't been to the hotspot? Are they going to have to do declarations?
Yeah, exactly the same as Western Australia, Northern Territory, South Australia, Tasmania. It's exactly the same. They'll have to then declare that they haven't been in a hotspot in the last 14 days, and they have to fly in. They can't drive, because if they drive, they'll be driving through a hotspot.
Is that just relying on people's honesty, though, or are you concerned people could still sleep?
We've always been concerned about that, but our police have done an absolutely brilliant job at working that through and managing that. And yes, we do depend, but we depend in our lives every single day for people to be honest.
Well, it is talking about aged care homes.
Yeah. Yes, our aged care facilities across the whole of Queensland have done an enormous amount of work to make their facilities as safe as they possibly can for their residents and enable those very important visits to occur. So I'm hopeful, as we've lifted those restrictions for the Darling Downs and Gold Coast, that if we have no more cases out in the community over the next week, that we'll be able to lift those restrictions for Brisbane, metropolitan area, and for Ipswich. Yes.
Can you explain why?
Yes, so as soon as we had those results, we explained them. So the issue with that one, it was a very complex situation. So we got a positive result in the middle of the night, and because I struggled with understanding where that person might have got the infection, I immediately asked for a second result to be done. But unfortunately, I couldn't rely on that second result because it was contaminated with blood, so they couldn't do the test. Now, then I was stuck with a positive result and a result I couldn't rely on. So, of course, I took the cautious view to treat it as a positive, and we went ahead and worked with the town. The town were brilliant. They came forward, they got tested. The people who'd been in close contact with the gentleman went into quarantine, and that all got managed. Then the coroner did a whole range of additional tests, which was possible for the coroner to do because he had that deceased body, so he could do further tests. But those tests were done quite late, and we don't have that clarification about what those tests, because the risk, as we've seen, one case could lead to a significant outbreak. The best thing to do for that town was to manage it as a positive case, and that's what we do all the time. So all the time when we get a positive case, until we have definitive advice, and we actually never got that, until we have definitive advice, we treat it as positive.
How many negative results do you need over that weekend, on Friday, Thursday? When did you decide, okay, that negative result we can now ease?
It was a whole accumulation of things, and in fact, no, there's no number. In fact, what was actually more important for me was the amount of testing we did in that town, and we didn't find another case. That was more important, because you've got to remember, we were doing these tests on someone who died. That's a really difficult situation. We don't have the validation for those sorts of tests. Our tests all go through a TGA approval process, and we don't have that for people who've died. We don't know what it means when someone dies and the virus starts to decompose. Is that the reason why it's negative? There are just so many very, very complicated issues that we have to deal with, but I know the facts. I know that one case can lead to an enormous consequence for that community. So you can imagine, there I've got a positive result that was done on a piece of equipment that we trust, saying it was positive, and that was the test that was done the quickest after the gentleman died. So that's the one I put most weight on. It took a lot of other negatives before I was confident enough to say I'll ignore that positive.
You said yesterday that every day you gave that information. That's the first time you gave that information. Why wouldn't that information be relayed to the family?
Look, I did provide information every day throughout that time. So there was a series of tests, but the right decision was made, and that was to act on the basis of one positive test. The ramification here is some people got tested who maybe did not need to. Compare that to the ramification of discounting a positive test, which could have been an outbreak in a small town. And so I'll stand by the decision that the Chief Health Officer made, the decisions that were made throughout that weekend, and stand by the communications that we gave to the community.
Is Queensland planning to accept another 500 international visitors per week? What would the cost be to Queensland of that?
Look, those discussions are underway at the moment, and I'm sure there'll be more to report on this afternoon. But the point I made yesterday was that it's the federal government's responsibility to take care of Australians while they're overseas, and so they should act to get them home, and they should meet the costs of hotel quarantine. I've never understood why the federal government have been able to abrogate their responsibility and force states to do quarantine for international arrivals when that very clearly should be the Commonwealth's responsibility.
Last one.
I understand there'll be more information about that later in the day. I don't want to comment until more information's to hand.
Just on the border, Gladys very quickly said yesterday that there's no conversations ongoing at all with New South Wales and Queensland. Is that relationship broken down completely?
I'm not going to comment on those personal relationships. I do know that Jeanette, our Chief Health Officer, speaks with the New South Wales Chief Health Officer pretty much every day. I speak with the New South Wales Health Minister most days as well. So there is good and strong ongoing collaboration between the two states, as there needs to be. We share a highly populated border.
But not premiers?
I'm not going to comment on those relationships. Thank you so much.